Today we're going to take a look at or talk about how to create drama in your painting. And to do that, we're going to take a look at some of the artists from the Hudson River School. The Hudson River artists painted between 1825 and 1870, and it was called the Native American or the New York School of Painting. New York was the center of it. Many of the members had studios in the famous 10th Street studio building in Greenwich Village, along with a lot of famous painters during that time, William Merritt Chase, John Singer Sargent. Now, the name Hudson River School first appeared in the New York Times in 1879, and it was more of a negative term because by then the style had gone out of favor with American collectors. And the paintings mostly depicted the Hudson River Valley, which was fast disappearing because of expansion. But they also painted the American landscape in general, showing the wild ruggedness of the West and Southwest with a focus on drama and detail, and very idealized and very dramatic. Here is a painting by Thomas Moran, the Green River Cliffs. And there was a lot of interest in the West, fueled by the paintings of the Hudson River artists. This was, again, the start of expansion. And for a lot of people who never traveled out west, this was their only view of the wilderness of the Rockies or the Southwest or California. So the drama in these paintings was very important. And when you stand in front of a giant Bierstadt of Landers Peak or Yosemite, you do feel like you're there again. So they do transport you to the West. And there's a lot of good artists to the school, but I've picked a few. Albert Bierstadt, Alfred Thompson Britcher, Thomas Troost Richards, and Frederick Edwin Church. And of course, I'm leaving out a lot of really good artists, George Ennis, Thomas Moran, Thomas Hill, John Kenneset. But I wanted to pick just a few, just because there's so many. We'd be here all day if I went with all the artists I really wanted to talk about here. But let's start with Albert Bierstadt. And he was born in 1830 in Prussia, died in 1902, but he moved to the U.S. when he was young, but returned to Germany to study at the Dusseldorf School of Art. And when he came back to the United States, he made several trips out west with the expansion, with the wagon trains, going out there and painting all these wonderful sights. And his purpose in doing that was, well, again, for sales, but to really give a view of what the West was like. And the more dramatic, the better. And his paintings were very expansive, very panoramic, a lot of detail, a lot of drama created by the strong dark and light. And composing these paintings, and they're very idealized. You would change things to make a better painting despite what the scene might have actually been like. But pushing that contrast between the dark and lights, carefully placing the strongest contrast to create the most drama, the most effect. But Bierstadt was very dramatic, very theatrical with his promotions. Back east, he would hire or rent out large theaters, charge people 50 cents, $1 to watch his paintings be unveiled in a dark room. He also had generated a lot of interest in his work with news stories and magazines and newspapers, and of course sold a lot of prints as well. And his paintings were really high demand. He earned some of the highest prices ever paid to an American painter at the time. And again, his paintings really inspired artists to travel to the West. Some art historians actually believe his paintings were marketing tools that encouraged settlers to move west. But again, the drama, having the foreground in shadow and the light in the middle ground, peeking out from the clouds, very, very dramatic. And a lot of these artists were criticized for this drama, being overly idealized, especially as their work went out of favor. The modernists kind of took over And it was a while before they came back into favor again, but it just doesn't bother me, this over drama, because when you're out west and you're seeing it for the first time and you're painting it, it is just overwhelming. And when you're painting it in order to show people back east who probably would never come out here what it would look like, I think the drama really served its purpose. And the detail, too, I think served it as well. I have no desire to paint this much detail, but I really love to look at it. And we can learn a lot from looking at their paintings, how they compose and how they really focus in on areas that pull you into the painting. This one, too, you can see, again, a lot of the strong contrast. Foreground shadow is very typical. Sunlight in the middle ground, sunlight in the clouds, and the light kind of breaking through and hitting the rocks in the river or the lake. Very dramatic and very detailed. But these paintings don't work if they don't organize these big shapes, these big dark and light areas in very simple terms to begin with. So in color sketches and drawings and laying out the painting in the large canvas, they have to see their painting more like this. When you still have the big shadow in the foreground, sunlight in the middle ground, shadow in the background, and sunlight in the sky, that light against dark, dark against light. But you have to see it in big, simple masses and shapes, because this is what holds the painting together. Then as you add the detail, or as they added the detail, it has to stay within those big shapes. I can't get too many light values in the foreground or too many real dark values in the middle ground light, or hardly any lights back here in the background, because the minute you do, you lose that separation and you lose the big masses that hold the painting together. So while there's so much detail in here, it doesn't fall apart. I mean, you can get lost in the detail and still feel like the scene holds together. This one a little less dramatic, but still just the depth and the atmosphere and just the feeling of just the size and scale is very, very dramatic, which is what you have out west, up in the mountains especially. A lot of atmosphere here. The depth here created by more of the stronger color in the foreground. And then as the rocks and the cliffs recede, the color gets more muted and grayer until you lose the color in the background. And that creates the depth and atmosphere. And the values too. Darkest in front and getting lighter as they go back. Here's more drama of the sunlight. Everything in the foreground very dark. And then the shadows and the shapes gradually kind of meld into the sunlight as they gradually get warmer because they're going into the sunlight and gradually disappear into the distance. Again, foreground shadow, the shaft of light hitting the waterfall in the middle ground, and the mountains gradually fading into shadow and then popping out in the sunlight again. Very dramatic, nicely detailed. But these guys could really paint. They could really show form because they know how to use values. And also, even though they're not impressionistic, there's a lot of strong, warm, and cool color to show depth, shadows, to bring things forward with stronger color, darker darks. Now let's switch to Alfred Thompson Britcher, born in 1837, died in 1908, and he was a businessman and painted at night, studied with Albert Bierstadt, didn't travel overseas to paint or to learn, but just strictly American-made artists. And he worked both in oils and watercolor. This is one of his outdoor sketches. These artists painted outside. One of the early artists that painted outside a lot. And these were their photographs. These is what they would paint from. These small paintings in oil or in watercolor, and a lot of drawings as well. The drawings tended to have the detail. The paintings, not so much. They were capturing more of the bigger shapes that they would make the composition out of. Hundreds of these color sketches, drawings, watercolors to kind of work through what the larger paintings are going to be. And I don't think they really had any idea of showing these paintings or any thought of showing them. These were just what they would use to create the larger paintings that they would show back east. Now, this is one of Britcher's oils. He painted a lot in watercolors too, one of the founding or early members of the American Watercolor Society. And even though not as dramatic as Bierstadt's Rocky Mountain paintings, still a lot of drama with the light sails, the dark water, the light cliffs, the dark accents around. Very nice. This has a lot more drama. Again, the dark darks in the foreground and the boat and the rocks really pull the foreground forward. And then everything kind of dissolves into the blue color, the lighter value of the distance to show that fog kind of moving in. Beautiful atmosphere there in those background mountains, going from light and cool to gradually darker and warmer. Again, the strong drama here, you have the foreground in shadow again, and the cliff in the middle ground catching, and the waves catching the bright sunlight. That's your strongest contrast there in the middle ground, with the white waves and the dark accents in the rocks. And then the background in shadow again, and then the sunlight hitting the clouds. Very, very dramatic. They knew how to do that well, but always composed well, always could render form really well. These cliffs here, while they're very detailed, the values are actually very simple. There's 3 to 4 values that he's using. You could get easily 9, 10 or more values, but when you simplify them to a dark, a light, a halftone, and maybe another light or another dark, that's going to simplify, and your shapes are going to read a lot easier than trying to put in every subtle value change. I mean, there's a lot of subtlety and a lot of detail, but again, those shapes hold together really well. Now, for him to, I think, set this painting up to make it work, he has to see it like this first. Create that drama with the big masses, the big shapes. Lightest light here, not the darkest dark in the middle. The darkest dark is in the foreground. But this is probably the most contrast, the light waves and the slightly lighter dark of the cliffs is probably the most contrast. This is not the most contrast down below. It has the darkest dark, but not the lightest light. And then in the background, the bigger masses and shapes of the clouds. If you can see it that way first, then this becomes a little more simple to paint. I was going to say it becomes easier to paint. Probably not easier, but more simple because you break things down to big shapes first. If your painting can work here before the detail, then the detail can sometimes just paint itself. But this is what makes the painting work in order to add the detail there. This is William Troost Richards, another American painter. I don't have as much on him, but he painted both watercolor and oil, probably known more for his watercolors. And this is a watercolor. It's an opaque watercolor. I don't know if he used gouache or casein, maybe a combination of transparent watercolor and gouache. But his stuff is beautiful. Again, very detailed, dramatic light, good use of dark and light value changes. And he painted on a heavy paper that was used to back carpet during that day. He found it a good texture to use with the watercolor. I don't know, I'm assuming he painted on canvas with oils. But I've seen a lot of his watercolors in Chicago, and a lot of them are fairly small, but just beautiful, full of detail, full of atmosphere, strong contrast. Again, knew his values really well, could render the form of his rocks and clouds. Did a lot of ocean scenes. Now, this was an oil painting of his. Again, foreground more in shadow, the sunlight in the middle ground, creating that strong drama. Beautiful paintings. This is one of his watercolors. You can see it's in a sketchbook. This is in a sketchbook that's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And very detailed. But again, this land mass out into the sea holds together really well, even though it's broken up with a lot of detail. Too often, when we add so much detail to a big shape, we lose it. We lose that big shape. But here the shape really holds together, contrasting the water and the sky. And detail, a lot of detail is easier to paint when you can reduce it to just 2 darks, 2 lights, and a halftone. Let's say 5 values. This is one of his oils, larger oils. Again, these big shapes, the dark in the foreground, the real light water where it's getting kind of foamy and very light, the darker cliff on the left, then the dark water and mountain in the background, then the light clouds and a little darker sky. So those big dark shapes and masses kind of play off each other, creating a lot of contrast and really good compositions. This is an oil sketch, again, outdoor. These were the photographs they use. Per se, they didn't have cameras, although by this time there were cameras around, but I doubt they were very easy to use or very easy to get. So relied mostly on these outdoor paintings and drawings. So they did not mess around when it was time to work. They had to be outside collecting material. And when you love doing it, you do it a lot. This is one of his oils here. Again, kind of shadow in the foreground, sunlight in the middle ground or mountain, and then the shadow again, and then the dark and light clouds. Very dramatic. A lot of detail here also, although not as much as Bierstadt, but you can see if you break this down to simple shapes and values. My sky's not too simple. Probably should have used less value changes to make it read better. The sky does not read as well. Breaking the sky down to just 2 values would have worked a lot better. But the cliff here, breaking it down to 2 or 3 values, 3 values in the water, simplifying what we're seeing first allows you to add the detail and the finish later. This is the important stage. This is what makes the painting work. Composing those big shapes and simplifying the values, making sure they hold together. Well, that was William Troost Richards. This is Frederick Edwin Church, probably the most famous of the Hudson River painters. He did paint overseas a lot. This is Middle East. This is Jerusalem. This is in Kansas City. I used to go see it all the time when I lived there. Probably 7 foot long, but just a beautiful painting. Again, composing those big masses and shapes, keeping things big and simple for as long as you can, then adding the detail at the end. But again, the foreground, somewhat in shadow. Everything's backlit, so the upright shapes of the trees, figures are dark, and then the flat planes and slanted are lighter, or the flat planes are lighter, slanted or darker as well. So focusing on simplifying the big shapes, finding the strongest contrast right here in the center of the painting. But it's very incredible painting. Very, very detailed, but he handles the detail so well. Again, I have no interest in painting like this, but it is just so beautiful. And a lot of thin paint. When you see a lot of these paintings in person, there's a lot of dark, a lot of shadow to contrast the light, and the darks are kept real thin. You can see the canvas through these trunks and kind of the toned canvas and some of these shadowed areas on the hills. A very nice painting. Composing those bigger, simpler shapes is what makes the painting work. So an interesting painting, probably black, burnt sienna, maybe some kind of ochre. Very simple. It's a night scene using maybe the ochre, the warmer burnt sienna in the clouds in the sky, and black and burnt sienna in the shadows. Very atmospheric, forcing everything into bigger, simpler masses and values first before breaking it up is the key to making it work. Painting from Greece, a lot of detail in the ruins. That foreground shadow allows the viewer's eye to skip over the foreground and hit the columns first in the background. Then your eye can come back and see the detail in front. And it helps to have flat areas that make some of the details stand out more. and keeping that sky big and simple so that the detailed ruins really stand out. It's a beautiful one here, I'm assuming somewhere in the Northeast, the Hudson River area, or it could be in Europe. There's real nice detail on the arch and the rocks. A lot of detail, a lot of drama, focusing the arch as the darkest dark, and the lightest light is right there in the kind of the center of the rocks, and throwing the foreground and shadow except for the figures. Figures, a lot of these guys were not figure painters. The figures show the scale maybe of the arch and the trees and everything, but they don't do a whole lot for the painting. But just beautiful job on those rocks. Church did a lot of ocean scenes, icebergs. It's an interesting painting. Again, very dramatic. The only spot of sunlight here is on the clouds, where the sun is kind of filtering through, very bright and orange against the darker, cooler violet and orange in the clouds and in the water. Not a lot of color variation. Orange and violet seems to be more of the big color scheme here. A lot of detail, even though there's a lot of shadow in the water and the clouds and the sky. If we try and think about how you want to see this in big shapes first, this is how you want to plan it out. So you can get the big value of the water first with a few smaller shapes of the sun reflecting on the water. Same thing with the clouds, 3, 4 different values, 2 or 3 different colors, clouds in the background, and then the sky. If you can see your painting this big and simple first, it's a lot easier to start to break it down into smaller detail. And you can add as much detail or as little as you want. A lot of studies, I have several here he did of the icebergs. You can see real quick color sketches as the sun is setting. Imagine a lot of this is done from memory because the sky is not going to stay right there that long. So another one here of the icebergs. Really nice color. Really thinking through how he wants to push the color temperature contrast, the real bright yellow and yellow-orange of the sunlit icebergs, and then the really bluish shadows. So that strong, warm, and cool temperature. What also makes the icebergs really stand out, the strong yellow and the strong blue of the icebergs, is the grayed sky. So having areas that are going to be more gray allows the 1 or 2 areas of strong color to really stand out. That way you don't want or you don't have bright color everywhere just screaming at you. You have the gray colors allowing the stronger colors to stand out. It's another color study. Dark blue shadowed icebergs against the lighter, warmer sky. That sets up the whole idea of the painting. And from here you can be as detailed as you want. And lastly, I don't know how big this one is, but again, very dramatic. That idea of the last of the sunlight before the sunset hitting the tip of the iceberg. And then the colors going from kind of a reddish violet to the green down to the dark water. Kind of balanced with the boat, the sails of the boat on the right and the sunlit cliffs on the left of center. And a lot of detail in the water, but it all holds together because those big shapes of the sky, the iceberg, the boat, the water, all separate really well. And a lot of times, too much detail forces those big shapes to not work as well. This is the last one here. Don't know the size of this one either, but very big, expansive view of the iceberg. You can see the detail in there. But once again, the dark and light shapes hold together. They don't fall apart. And we tend to, if we're going to make mistakes in detail and losing the big shapes of our painting, is adding too many value changes in the shadow and or the sunlight. And those shapes tend to fall apart and don't separate as well. But beautiful job here. If you get a chance, a lot of the American museums here have a lot of the Hudson River School painters. They might have just 2 or 3, but well worth seeing just because of the size and the scope of them and the drama that's there.